right, welcome everyone to the Farmer Angel Network's 2021 to 2022 Farm Community Online Monthly Education Events, where we're promoting positive mental health and well-being. We just want to remind everyone that today we will be recording. So if you would like to share your experiences to help others and reach out to help and reaching out for help or resources, please only share what you're comfortable with in a public setting, as these are going to be recorded and will be posted to our public social media sites for the purpose of connecting with others looking for information regarding the agriculture community, positive mental health and well-being resources. And if at any time the Farmer Angel Network members and or the presenter feel the learner needs additional support or resources, we'll reach out and provide information post-session. So today we welcome you for joining us for this month's topic. We have Cheryl, the Agriculture Safety and Health Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, speaking today on Children Will Do What You Do. If you're interested in receiving materials or copies of PowerPoints or anything of the sort, or would like to get the recording emailed to you, feel free to reach out to the Extension office or to the Farmer Angel Network group, and we'll be sure to reach out to you with those details. Just a quick bio for Cheryl. She has over 20 years of experience in programming in the areas of ag safety and health. In her early extension career, she worked as the 4-H and Youth Development Agent in Pierce and St. Croix counties. She received her Bachelor of Science in Ag Education from University of Wisconsin River Falls and is currently the Senior Outreach Specialist with Extension for Ag Safety and Health, a departmental center with biological systems and engineering. Her outreach focus includes the Wisconsin Safe Operation of Tractor and Machinery Certification Program, occupational safety and health programs for ag producers, and rules related to operating implements of husbandry and ag commercial motor vehicles on public roads. She has also been the National Chair for the Extension Disaster Education Network. I'm going to stop sharing. So we really appreciate everyone joining. From the Farmer Angel Network. We are so appreciative of Cheryl joining us today to give her perspective. We know that the farm is not just about us, but also about the youth that are on there. So we really look forward to hearing what she has to share today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl.
Thank you. Let me get set here. And given our participation today, if you'd like to, in the chat box, just make a comment too about you and your interest, and we can check that out. Lena, are you seeing my share screen okay? I'm getting a funny box here saying start.
Yeah, I'm seeing the funny box too, but otherwise it looks good.
Okay, I'm not sure why I am getting the funny box. If you'll bear with me a minute, let me stop sharing and go back to my PowerPoint.
I think you hit rehearse instead of present.
That's what I'm wondering. Okay. Sorry about this. Always some new technical glitch. I'm telling it to start from the beginning, but it's not.
No worries, Cheryl.
Yeah, but it's not advancing. Well, we're going to have the start rehearsing box show up there. And hopefully we can get rid of that. So today I titled this, Children Will Do What You Do.
Do you want to share the screen?
Oh, I thought I was.
I'm going to mute myself because I have another train coming through.
Okay, now are we good?
You are perfect, Cheryl.
And there's your train. So today I titled this "Children Will Do What You Do." You know, we often hear this the saying, do what I say, not what I do. And so, but when we're looking for, working and leading by example, kids are great at observing us and watching us. And so when I wanted to talk about child safety and thinking about some of the mental health aspects that you've been looking at over the course of your time together, I wanted to include a little bit about that even if you're not feeling good about something, the children in your life can pick up on that. And so we need to all work together. And we know that when it gets to be a stressful time, as our field work is picking up, that, these kids on our farm, we're going to want them to be having the opportunity to be on the farm. But what are some of those child safety opportunities that we can do to help prevent injuries or illnesses and adding more to the stress of the situation? So why Elena gave you a little bit of my bio, I told her I'll make it a little bit more personalized as we get started here so that you have a chance to know about me and how I fit into the big scheme of ag safety and agriculture here in Wisconsin. So the barn in the upper photo is the home barn that I grew up with, the typical dairy farm of the late 60s, 1970s here in Wisconsin. And so I grew up between the Stoughton, Cambridge area. The barn still stands, but it stands empty and used for storage these days. And the lower photo is one that I took on Monday morning as I was out on the farm. And, I enjoy these 3 oaks, but, for me, it's the memory of, we'd go to the woods and bring the cows up. And the ice storm of 1976 took out most of those trees over the time. And we're left with these 3 oak trees. And so even though things have changed on our farm, that sun keeps rising and there's always a tomorrow for somebody, and each day brings something new. So as was mentioned, I started my career as a 4-H and youth agent with UW Extension up in Pearson, St. Croix County. And my friend that I'm with here is still in Extension out in the state of Washington. And so early in our career, we did an overnight career tours to help kids look at some of those jobs and opportunities that would be out there, but they happened in the nighttime. So our first stop was WCCO, which is a major news network up in the Twin Cities areas. And so they let us come onto stage and we did fun places like Delta let us into their repair floor, and the Minnesota Airport took us into their security facility and into the tower. So we got into some unique places. But why I was at 4-H and youth agent in the late 80s, it also was the time of a farm crisis. And so even though I was a 4-H and youth, it still impacted my work as, a lot of people that I worked with as 4-H families and the kids, they had that stress of the farm crisis and families looking for that off-farm work to help support the farm. I remember a meeting one night after a dairy leaders meeting and, sitting there with a couple of the dairy leaders talking about what would be, the potential next steps. So in the lower left corner here, as was mentioned, I have done a lot of work in recent years with the implement of husbandry rules and updating those. And that was a great opportunity to serve our agricultural community and have those discussions about how our agriculture has changed and grown and needing our rural roadways to work with our community. In the lower right-hand corner here is one of the tractor safety programs from last summer. And, it's a program that I've worked with pretty much throughout my 37 year career, and something that we'll talk about further. And then my dairy worker boots, as OSHA discovered dairy farms in the last part of this. I've put on a lot of boots and walked around different farms and done safety checks and so, I've covered a lot of ground in my time here with UW Extension. So in my personal life, I am getting ready to transition to retirement at the end of 2022 here. So on the left-hand picture, my mom got a puppy last September. So this is our family member, Henry. And Henry and I have bonded this winter playing fetch in my dad's shop on the farm. The Kubota is about as big of a tractor as I'm driving these days and pretty much doing yard work with it. But I do get some time in that tractor seat. The machine that I operate the most is my semi-industrial sewing machine. And, so this one goes 1,500 stitches a minute. So think about having your hands around farm machinery. I think about having my fingers in close to something that is going and stitching 1,500 stitches per minute. I just saw a photo on Facebook this morning of a woman who ended up in the ER due to the getting caught in the needle, and I'm hoping to prevent that. So I just wanted to pause before, now that I'm done introducing myself and as we get in the topic. And as I was preparing for this, I was reading about some of the stresses, and it was talking about, how we can build happiness. And one of the things was how different smells, create a happy sense for us. So I just thought this morning it would be kind of a fun way to introduce maybe what is something, and if you could put in the chat box for me, what is one of those scents from childhood that brings back a happy memory, and maybe, just a short little bit about what that happy memory. So I have my almond extract here and my cardamom, which are, spices and baking. And both of my grandmothers were really good at baking. Cardamom, I learned more about in my travels to visit family in Norway. And so these are just two spices that bring back those happy memories of family members and baking with my family members. So take a minute and chat if you can think of something that's a smell or a scent that brings back a happy memory from your childhood. Melissa, lilac is a great one. I have lilacs in my yard named Homer and Vera. They are my great aunt and uncle, and the plants came from their farm over in the Sauk City area. So that's a real happy scent. Heather, the fresh mown hay, girlfriend that you saw in the picture when I was a 4-H agent, she and her daughter came back to visit in Wisconsin a few summers ago, and we're driving down the road, and it was a great day. The windows were down, and Mara said, "Oh, Mom, what is that smell?" And it was, that fresh mown hay, and it was fun to see a young kid, early teens, enjoying that scent of fresh mown hay. Elena likes the barn, all those years of showing and working with dairy cattle. I still have that memory of washing dairy cattle and using the baby blue to get the animals white, and just that whole smell when you say that, Elena. So we can think about those scents and those happy memories, and we really want to be sure that our kids, and our families that we're working with come away from the farm and have those happy memories and those different scents. I can tell you, when I thought about this and I thought about what would be a bad scent, silage that's gone rotten or bad is one of those scents that I just can't tolerate. And I think it comes from, we bought a farm, there had been a barn fire, we had to clean out the silo, and it was just an awful smell, and one of those bad memories. So since you guys were focused on mental health, and as I was looking on some of the different resources, I just thought, this graphic from WHO, the World Health Organization, talking about factors that relate to the mental health of our youth, it kind of overwhelmed me with all the different factors. And I thought about, how do we even get kids growing up, with all these different factors? But there's components of each of them. And as we look at them, I think for me, that family and community one are two really big areas. And, looking back and thinking through the years and through my life, those family times, the community part of being in 4-H and FFA, those relationships to other families in our ag community were important. So I think we're all here today because those relationships are important. And I apologize, I keep going awkward here on my clicker. So, when we look at safety, we have to look at injury prevention. And, the question of what's the situation, and it's always a question that I get from people doing news stories and things of, are we doing better in our farm safety area? And, over the 30 plus years, what's changed? Where can we work towards in the future? And so I just wanted to share, for those that aren't familiar with this, the last data that we have was from the two reports in 2017 and 2018. And you can see that farm production work is still a significant part of where we see our farm fatalities. And we don't have a great reporting system out there. So we can be missing things, and we don't have the data on those injuries, but we know that injuries, illnesses create stress, they can create financial concerns, they can have significant impacts on families. And so, I say every year that my goal for the year to the groups that I work with is, 0 fatalities. And as we've seen those numbers change through the years, different situations come in, but it's still a goal of 0 for the year here in Wisconsin. Just to show you the age breakout, and we're talking about those kids today. In those 2 years, there were 6 youth that died in that farm-related fatalities that were under the age of 18. And, over the course of my career, I've seen that number, bounce around. And some years it's like, what's going on, what changes, but we see different times that, there are these tragedies out there. And, using the reference from the 2020 Childhood Ag Injuries Fact Sheet from the National Children's Center for Rural Ag Safety and Health, about every 3 days, a child dies in an ag-related incident, and each day at least 33 children are seriously injured. And, I think when I consider that fact, and as we apply it, it's like, when you have a serious injury, it adds to the stress of the situation. It can add to the work that still needs to be done on a farm. But I've also had those calls where, between family members, there's discussions of, should the child have been out there? I wanted us to be aware, and, seeing Melissa online here, it's like, Melissa, you could be doing this part of it and doing it much better, is that there's this, the NIOSH Ag Center, so the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. One of their agricultural centers is the National Children's Center for Rural Agricultural Safety and Health. And this is part of the Marshfield Clinic and the National Farm Medicine Center up in Marshfield, Wisconsin. And there is a wealth of child safety resources located here at the cultivatesafety.org. And I think it's, when we're looking for those guiding fact sheets of what can help us, make some of those decisions, tools that we can use to help our youth learn about egg safety, helping employers of our youth know how to provide that training, know how to reach and work with them, highlighting what are some of those hazards that we may not think about. The cultivatesafety.org is a great place. And I'm going to take the risk here of stopping this share from the PowerPoint and hop on to the Cultivate Safety website, because I really, for this NIOSH Center, and NIOSH is the research branch of the Center for Disease Control. And so I actually started here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in biological systems engineering in 1990 on a NIOSH egg research project. And so that's what brought me into the agriculture field. And I think one of the good outcomes over the course of my career that I've seen became this focus into the child safety and the concerns. So the cultivatesafety.org, lots of different resources that you can use, that you can use for discussion, that you can take a look at the guidelines. I really like the youth work guidelines because they've developed these a lot further over the course of time, and looking at some of the common tasks and what the age is, and their guidelines. They're that point to have you have that discussion, look at your children, look at what might be the hazards to them, what you might need to take into consideration. So if you're having the discussion between yourself and a spouse, or yourself and somebody else in the family, and there's a differences, the guidelines give you a great place to look for. I'm going to hop to under the accident tab here. And, one of the things you may be looking for is what is that situation, what's out there. So the Ag Injury News is a great resource if you're ever looking for what's happening, what are some of those injury stories, such as the one that I showed earlier with the little 4-year-old from the UK. They're tracking those and helping us find some of those statistics. But more importantly, some of those situations we may not think about, or they don't happen consistently enough in one place, but looking at the broader spectrum of things, we can start pulling together. So I do a lot of work with like the nutrient applicators, otherwise custom manure haulers. And, we start looking at manure gases. We've had incidents here in Wisconsin, but this last summer it was incidents out in Ohio. There's been incidents in Michigan. And so we can use that wealth of resources to start pulling together and looking at some of those factors. So take a look, browse through that area of this website. The other one that I think is really important, and here's that Ag Injury News that I was talking about. So you can visit the site, and you just need to sign in to log in if you want to go further into the details with it. But lots of different information available there. Oops, I am sorry that I keep jumping around there. So anyhow, we've looked at the Cultivate Safety. And so are we back on my PowerPoint? Can somebody give me the heads?
Cheryl, you're still sharing the Cultivate Safety webpage.
Okay, so all of a sudden I jumped back to my PowerPoint here, which is like, wait a minute, this is not making sense to me.
I think you're still on the websites, actually, from my visual.
Okay, So I need to get my,
I see the cultivatesafety.org, safety tools is what we're
Okay.
seeing at the moment.
so I'm going to stop sharing and that'll clear everything and it brings us back, right?
Yep,
Okay. When one way works or fails, figure out the next. So the Safer Farm, just wanted to take a moment and point this part of this site out because I think sometimes it's about having the checklist, having a resource. And this was one that, as I was looking at some of the forms in the library that you could use, if you're not sure what you might be looking for as potential hazards, some really good different areas, different specific things that you could be using on this one to look for and to say, okay, how are we doing? Where could we improve upon in our safety and what might be of concerns to us? And it's not just farm related. They have, ag retail, they have agritourism, the livestock. So there is a wealth here and we couldn't cover it all today, but I did want to make this NIOSH Center you aware of those resources and give you the opportunity to look further. So I'm going to stop that share. Any questions, especially, I have the advantage of knowing Melissa and she works with the National Farm Center and is part of this center. And so if you do have specific questions, I'm sure she'd be glad to answer a question that I may not be able to. So there's some places you can go for resources, but I wanted to kind of hit some of the highlights of some of the different ages and stages as we look at youth development, working it as it relates to child safety. The other day, as I was browsing on a social media, I saw this post on an Instagram, and it just kind of struck the chord with me. Popcorn is prepared in the same pot, in the same heat, in the same oil, and yet the kernels do not pop at the same time. Don't compare your child to others. Their turn to pop is coming. And I think that's one of the real important things when we look at children and people say, what will be the best age for my kid to do X, Y, and Z? And it's really going to vary with that child. It can't compare one child to the next. I grew up on that dairy farm, but we also raised 15 acres of tobacco. And I have an older sister who's 18 months older than I am. So they put us both on the tobacco planter together so that, we would learn to drop and plant and work as a team together. But at the same time, we have our differences and in some ways, looking back at it, it's like, well, that might not have been the best thing to do, but it worked out and we planted a lot of tobacco over the course of our lifetime. But each of us are different. And so I wanted to start, and some of you may have the toddlers. They could be your own children. It could be children that come to visit. This past weekend, my niece has twin girls who are 2.5 years old, and they came out to great grandma's farm to drive their little ATV in the machine shed, which most of our machinery is gone after my father passed away and we had an auction. So it's a great open space for kids to learn something like that and to be in a little bit more controlled situations. But being around those, fast acting, toddlers and preparing for this program, it kind of brought back a few things about working with this age group. And this is an age group that early on in my career, when I was looking at some of the ages of kids being injured on our Wisconsin farm, it really surprised me, being new into the field, that in that set of data that I was looking at, that age 2 was the age of most kids that were being killed on our farms. And, they were being ran over by that father, that grandfather, or their uncle. And it wasn't that they were out there working on the farm. It was more that they were out there in that work site and, they were riding along with somebody, or they saw them coming and they ran out to meet them. And with the size of the equipment, somebody didn't see them, or they were playing in some place. And, as they start to walk and they move about, they can move pretty quickly. So dangers to those toddlers, the choking, the strangling, the suffocation. One of the things I haven't seen in many years, but it was another one that I hadn't thought a lot about, was it used to be the practice when I was a child, to hang baler twine along the ladder up into the haymow. And there were a number of kids that were on that haymow ladder and slipped and got caught and strangled in those baler twine, just hanging along that ladder. And so that goes along with those slips and falls, the poisonous substances. Through the years, we had a concern with milk house pipeline chemicals. And I remember the cases of somebody, an older child giving a cocktail to their younger sibling in the milk house and not realizing what they were really giving them. We want to do what our parents, a grandparent, somebody that we're watching, see and do, to be able to drive that tractor, to be able to sit in the Bobcat. When my great nieces left the other day and I had taken the key out of that Kubota tractor and I went to move the tractor, and it's like the flashers came on, the lights came on, the lock for the bucket was on. They had touched all those knobs and controls as they were driving that tractor. So, lots of different things to consider with those toddlers. Animals, it's a lot of times it's that size factor. And so, through the years, I've seen the cow push the gate and the gate fell on the young toddler that was out in the barn. And so, we have different considerations when those young youth are out there. This is really that area that, machinery, not understanding the rules, come into play. And for our toddlers, this is one where it's, how can we help address childcare? How can we help create those safe play areas? Looking at them more from not being a worker on the farm, but being in that work site and trying to keep them safe by keeping them out of that work site. The dangers to our young school age kids, this is some of the same factors that come into play. They're still learning to make those decisions, to be able to follow those rules, and they're not necessarily trying to disobey or ignore them as much as it's putting them all together and making that decision and having that capability of being able to think about that decision. And even though they might make that right decision today, tomorrow we might have to reinforce that decision. They're going to like to play with the tools, the equipment. Firearms have been a concern. Playing with fire, I always go back to the memory. Years back, we were doing a number of rural safety days and kids out on farms. And we were doing a safety day out on a farm up in Marathon County. And one of the kids that was from the host family, we were missing that child and two cousins. Well, it turned out that they had gone to the haymow and they were playing with matches. And so the family, behind the scenes was addressing these kids and the playing with fire in a barn that had previously, been rebuilt after a fire. But even when we're in a controlled educational setting, something like that still happened. I was just glad that they put the connecting the dots that they were missing together and nothing happened that day. They like to climb, they like to explore. We had a big rope in our hay mow when we were kids, and we could go up there and we would swing on that. And all of a sudden one day my dad cut it down, and the neighbor kids had come across, and he caught them up in the barn swinging on it and with other things in the barn. He just didn't want that risk, and so that ladder had come down. So by the nature of young school age kids, they're great helpers. But at the same time, you know, they can find their way into places or into things that we need to consider the hazards for them. In recent years, I have done more work related to the Youth Tractor and Machinery Program, which puts me working with those 12 to 16-year-olds, the dangers to the teenagers. And, you know, teenage years are interesting years. And so the kid in my life, you know, glad the day he graduated from high school, still worry about him. And that at 24 years of age. But, you know, some of the things through those teenage years, once they start driving, once they're, you know, looking to make those decisions for their own, that peer pressure that can come into play, you know, it makes it all the more dangerous out there. And so this is an area where, you know, by having those discussions, having those rules and policies early on with the kids helps create, you know, a better conversation with them as they get older. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't spend a lot of, you know, nights not sleeping, waiting for that text message that he was leaving his friends and coming home, but, you know, they're going to grow up on us. And some other factors of teenage, and I have lost my source from this, and this comes from one of the cultivatesafety.org publications and that. But we can see that, you know, pressure in themselves, trying those new experiences, helping them break things down and learning. This summer, when we did a tractor and machinery certification program, we had the one student, and you came to the driving night, and, you know, he had the lean to him in the tractor seat, you know, wanted to have the one hand on the steering wheel. And, you know, the instructor had the conversation with him about, you know, we need you to be engaged with this tractor. We need both hands on the steering wheel. And, you know, by the next week, though, when it came that he had to pass a driving test and there was all these things to consider, we saw, you know, a whole different youth, and he was looking to work for somebody else. So he really needed to get that course passed. And he did a great job in quite the change in a week's worth of time. So pausing here again, and, you know, for those of you that, you know, have kids on the farm or will be working with kids on the farm, you know, just wanted to see, put in the chat box, at what age should a youth start driving a tractor? So just take a moment, if you're comfortable using that chat box. What age do you think a youth should start driving tractor or operating tractor? Good answer, Aleda. When they are big enough physically to handle the equipment versus just an age. So there's a lot of factors that go into this discussion. And the reason I put it age was, you know, with the tractor and machinery certification program, that we can offer it here to 12-year-olds in Wisconsin that are going to be operating for their own parents and guardians, and that allows them to operate on public roads. You know, one of those factors that it is more than, being able, as Melissa is saying, that they can reach the clutch and the brake, that they can see behind them. In the modern hydrostatic tractors of today, it's not as much about pushing in that clutch as, just all the different controls and operations that we have. So the tractor and what that age is, again, it's going back to that earlier point of, we need to consider, each kid is going to be different. So one of the changes I've seen over the course of my career is when I started, it was pretty common that the age for kids to drive tractors across our countryside here in Wisconsin was age 9. And, fathers and uncles and grandfathers would say, well, I started driving at 5. Well, you might have been driving, holding on to the steering wheel with somebody else operating at 5. Some kids were probably truly out there, operating at 5. And when the Legislative Study Committee in the early 90s looked at agricultural safety and started the program and put in that 12-year-old requirement to operate on public roads here in Wisconsin, they had no lower age limit to it. And so the first year, our programs were swamped with kids wanting to take the program. And I was really surprised when the youngest participant that came to the program was age 6. And she was driving full loads of hay bales down the road. And she didn't end up completing the course because the community conversation around what was age appropriate happened. And so, her father took her out of the course and revisited having her driving those loads of hay down the road at that time. So with the requirement here that kids have to be 12 to take the course for their own parents or guardian and not at work, it's kind of increased that age that people look at for their kids learning to drive those tractors and operate them. So the skid steers come into play. And so one of the most interesting conversations that I remember having, we were out doing family walkabouts on a farm. And this would be, we'd have the parents, we'd have kids doing activities, and I would take the parents and we'd walk through the farm and look at some of the different hazards. And I had this couple, and you could tell it was kind of tense between them, and they were having one of those discussions. And finally, the father said to me, he's like, so at what age can I have my kids driving the skid steer? And so I explained, that skid steer, take a lot more development, and that, to work on a farm, you need to be 16 and to work and operate a skid steer outside of that farm, you need to be 18. And the mother is like, okay, so what was going on was that the father was seeing the skid steer as their safer piece of equipment than a tractor. So they had those kids that were younger operating the skid steer because he saw that as a safer piece of equipment. And the mother was in disagreement that she wasn't wanting the kids to be operating that skid steer. So it made for an interesting dynamic. It made for stress. We talked through what they were looking at, the age of their kids, and really encouraged them to wait longer to operate that skid steer. So sometimes the thoughts out there is we got a safer piece of equipment with the skid steers, but tractors still come into play. So whether we're operating that tractor, we're operating a vehicle, we're operating, some piece of machinery, I use this graphic and I recognize that there's a lot more European road symbols on it, but it's that factor that when we're operating that tractor, that equipment, we got a lot of different factors. And when we put it out and we take it out onto the road, it's not only that equipment, that machinery, it's the road, it's the other driver. And so real consideration into, is our youth ready to operate out on that road? And I really strongly encourage parents, to look at those kids being 16, having that driver's license, going through driver's education in a lot of our road situations, because it is a high risk area. And, maybe there's small trips they can make and that with equipment, or, the less traveled roads that they can be traveling on. But because we have that course, doesn't mean that kid's ready to be operating out in those road situations. And there's still a lot of supervision, a lot of training that needs to occur. Our training programs aren't just a one and done for us as kids, and even as adults. I know a lot of the custom operators that I work with, they talk about the situations that they've seen and share some of their concerns about operating equipment and out on the roads. There are things we know we can do, and I just wanted to focus in on with our youth, and as we get operating out there, the tractor injuries, having them on those tractors with those rollover protective structures, keeping things in good maintenance. The extra rider has gotten more of a conversation around having that extra person in a buddy seat or a learner seat, and some of our tractors have those available. When I started out, we were talking about extra riders more on being on fenders, riding on the back end of tractors, but I still see that as some of our newer farmers, our beginning farmers, our small scale farmers are picking up some of that equipment, and some of those issues are coming back into play with the extra rider. But even for a youth learning to drive tractors, starting out operating, having that adult in there to help instruct them is one thing. Having that buddy, having a younger sibling, somebody that takes their attention away from operating is probably not the practice that we want to be encouraging, along with limiting and restricting that use of that cell phone, that mobile device in those tractors when they're operating it. A family training on tractors and equipment as we start and we kick off the spring season is a great way to get going, to help assess what your child may be ready to do for the year, things that they may need to work on. It can be a way to take one of those maintenance checklists and go through it and see, is everything here? What are going to be those daily things that you really want your family to be checking before they operate it, or for employees? I would remind everyone that, with the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, it's the employer's responsibility to train their employees in tractors and machinery on an annual basis. So even if you've had somebody working for you, that annual employee training is a good practice and a good part to meet that legal obligation. It doesn't mean it's just one and done for the year, because if something changes, we bring out a new piece of equipment, it's a good practice to go through that machinery with them. But you want everybody knowing the controls, how to start and stop it, any special hazards of working with that equipment. So training, and why the term training can catch people up, talking through, looking at things, and the use of checklists can be really a beneficial thing to reducing those tractor and, I would say, machinery operation. Our equipment has changed a lot. There's still some of those old tractors out there, and we see them in use, and there's a great antique market out there. But at the same time, there's a lot of newer tractors that have more technology. We were using a hydrostatic tractor at one of our tractor safety this year, and it had a feature to it, and we were having a hard time getting it started. And we had another tractor that, it was a newer model, and It had controls in different locations, more a European influence in the design of it than here in the US. And we all had some challenges figuring out how to get that one going. Oops, now what did I, sorry about this, guys. There we go. So a good starting place can be just spending time, helping your children have those discussions, watching you, learning. I did a training program down at Black Hawk Tech for post-secondary students this fall, and we went out looking at machinery and implements of husbandry for lighting and marking. But it was a great conversation with them about some of, what they had learned as in their childhood and things that they would pass on to others to learn. And that time together where we really think back towards that focus on mental health, it also means that it's a way to continue those conversations. And when we're working, sometimes it helps relieve our stress over other things, but the ways that we can keep conversations going is doing some of those things together. And I've mentioned that, my father passed away, that we go to his shop, but that shop is one of those places where we had a lot of discussion, handing tools, and helped me build some of the skills that I have today. Machinery operation is a broad spectrum of different types of machines out there. I use this TMR blade just because I always think in this area, there's so many things we have around our farms that chop, that cut, that move things that you can get entangled with. And, taking the time to really look at your machinery, what is appropriate, what are some of the risks to it. I think the machine operation definitely is one of those areas that it goes up in age, and the focus on having it used safely and some significant training with it. Falls, taking a look around your farm. As I was walking around the grain bin, just checking things recently, I realized that even though these grain bins aren't used, we still have this makeshift ladder that my dad was notorious for welding to get them up to the ladder that's on the bin. And, it's one of those that had it been a nice day, we didn't have the control over my, great nieces. This is one of those things that needs to come down once the ice melts off and I can remove it from the base, because, to a little kid, it would be a place to climb. I remember, when we were younger, the story was that a friend of our family, their 4-year-old climbed to the top of their harvester and they couldn't find him. And somebody realized that he was sitting up on the top of the harvester. And why he was, a strong kid, a tall kid at 4, he was able to make his way up to the top of the harvester, but he couldn't figure out how to get himself down the ladder from the harvester. And so those places that we can fall from, hay mows were a lot more common when I was a kid, but they're still out there. And I can say I'm one of those kids that fell out of the hay mow. So looking at where we have ladders and equipment and removing some of those hazards. Animals in this state, we have a whole variety. I like this sheep picture because they all seem like they're looking intently at us and in the conversation. But this might be the area that we start those kids into those age appropriate chores, but helping them know where some of those work areas are, helping them understand about, the animals and working with those animals safely and what some of their behavior means. I showed you early on those pictures of the 3 oak trees and said we go down there and that was a woods and we'd get the cows. Well, it was also when it was a woods and we'd go get the cows that I spent about an hour of my life in a hay wagon, a hay rack in the woods, because the bull had decided that was where, he didn't want me out there with those cows that night when I came to bring them up. And he sat there pushing his head into that hay rack and rocking it. My dad came home from harvesting tobacco and realized that I wasn't milking cows and brought the truck down to the barn, and that bull went the next day. But I, was older and I could tell that that bull was not going to be having me. And so I went to the place that I could get the fastest. So lots of different factors when we think about animals, and we have a lot of kids showing animals and working with animals, but it's an area that we also see injuries with. So lots of different considerations with animals. The grains and feeds, this is an area that over the course of time, we would see kids caught in the flowing grain. At one point in time, the gravity wagon was a place that, kids would ride in the gravity wagons, or they, help push out the grain. And I included feed in this one because we had a case where kids were playing in one of the poly feed bins, and the feed company came out to fill it, and not realizing that there was kids in that feed bin. And unfortunately, one of the youth lost their lives. So those are confined spaces. We want to keep them out. We need to keep those ladders locked off so they can't get in them. Lots of different illness factors that can happen due to the respiratory issues in and around grain. Chemicals I mentioned a little bit about earlier, and I think one of the biggest thing here is, keep them in a closed system, have them in locked containers, having those labels on products, that SDS safety data sheets available if somebody does get into something. Before my great nieces came the other day, I went through the shop, I moved a bunch of stuff, I put them in cabinets, I moved them to higher shelves, just realizing what we had around there and thinking about how fast they could get into something, even though we were there and supervising them, just trying to remove some of those. One of the things you could do, and it's going to help remove that stress, is look to practice and talk about your emergency plans for first aid and rescue. And this is one that, we might not think about as a safety preventive side of things because it's after something has happened. But just like doing fire drills, bus drills, it helps those kids feel calmer and understand the situation and get a better response. And if they're the ones having to make the call. So talking about, where is that information? In this day and age, we run with our cell phones, but having some place where it's like, okay, what's the fire number, or where's the location? What are you going to give them as a name to the farm? And so when they might need to be the one calling 911, that, as a family member, everybody has some experience. And of course, I'm recognizing they're going to need to be a little bit older to be the ones making those calls. But, think about your emergency response plans and having them prepared for that farm setting. I have one colleague that, we joke with because he was out baling stalks, and 25 acres later of a fire, what the possibly all could have gone wrong in that scenario. The first time I had to call the 911 from our farm back in 2016, they were like, we don't have that fire number. Well, our farm's been there for all these years, and we didn't have a fire number in the 911 system here in Dane County. So just having that practice, having people prepared, will help with a more positive outcome. So one of the things that Amanda and Elena and I had discussed was having some support for community efforts. And so through the years, we worked with things like Rural Safety Days, different FFA programs. There used to be a program here in Wisconsin that supported the FFA Safety Award, and I have a bunch of the old medals down in my office as I'm cleaning things out. support those youth tractor and machinery certification programs in your area, work with agribusinesses on different types of safety programs that could involve your kids and your family. There's lots that we've done through the years, but there's also great opportunity out there to continue. I had a news reporter this morning. He's like, well, you know, is there really a story here? And it's like, every year there's new kids, there's new families, or employees, or their families come to the farm. There's people visiting their farm, there's friends. So all of these efforts, even though we've been talking about agricultural safety here in Wisconsin, the first specialist was hired in 1943. There's still things that we can do and support our agriculture of today and keeping that safety a focus. So as we think about the springtime, some of those activities we can do to remove those stresses, recognizing that we want our young people to grow up into, you know, healthy, resilient adults, you know, putting some of the mental health side of this into practice with them, having that open conversation. I think as we all start being more open about the stresses of farming, the mental health side of things, it'll help us for the future with everyone. We want to be sure that we have that next generation coming up. We talk about, you know, them taking over. We'll have different situations. I was like, I apologize that this was the picture I had, because I thought, well, you know, this could be a, you know, the female family member, you know, out there looking to be the next generation, or siblings together, or lots of different connections in our family. But this was just kind of like, to me, that handshake passing on to the next generation. So once again, my contact information, as I kind of mentioned, I'm looking to retire July 5th of this year. So I got a few more months and a few more days of working around, but I will be staying here in Wisconsin. This is sunset from my home, from part of the farm. And I truly have a love of Wisconsin agriculture, and will stay engaged in and supporting it. And I'm here to help you out. So with that, I will stop sharing. Just if we have any comments or questions, I don't mean to, you know, stop anybody. Feel free to open up your microphones.
No, thank you so much, Cheryl. I'm seeing some comments coming in about, you know, it's a great webinar and you're doing, keep up the great work. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If there's any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself, and feel free to ask. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to pull up my screen to share quick. This is our next meeting we have coming up, our last of the season. So Wednesday, March 16th at 12, we will be having Monica Kramer-McConaughey, a rural mental health specialist, Eyes on the Horizon Consulting, discussing Bend Don't Break, staying mentally healthy even in difficult times. And that is where you'll be able to register at. So again, feel free to follow up Farmer Angel Network on Facebook to keep up with our upcoming events. And I will drop that registration link in the chat. So we really appreciate you all joining us today. And I'm not seeing any comments in the chat. So with that, Cheryl, I think you did such a good job. No one's got questions for you. But if we do, we'll be sure to get you guys connected. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions, thoughts, or if you would like additional resources. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I will stop recording.